It counts how we God talk. He, him, his. She, her, hers. They, them, theirs. It counts how we God image. Almighty Father. Nursing mother. Partnered parents.
That was Sarai Lambert Pixton reading a poem by Rachel Hunt Steenblik from the book Mother's Milk. And I get to talk with Sarai today. Sarai is one of my very favorite people to talk with, especially about this topic. I'll do a little brief introduction. Sarai and I met a few years ago when she joined my husband's extended family. So my name is Sarah Pixton without an H, and her name is Sarai Lambert Pixton. So we're pretty much the same person, but just a little mix.
Yes.
Yes. So she married my husband's cousin. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And we get to do family dinners together and chat, and she's a wonderful, wonderful person that I'm excited to get to meet today. We were talking a little bit before we started recording about how sometimes you don't know what spaces it's safe to talk about Heavenly Mother in. So that's one of the reasons we're doing this podcast, is to say, like, hey, here's a space and let's make more spaces and let's talk about Heavenly Mother just like we talk about Heavenly Father, because they're partnered parents, right? As Rachel Hunt Steenblik said in that poem. But the first time that I recognized that Sarai was a safe place was, I think I've mentioned before on this podcast that I am a birth doula, and I got to be Sarai's doula, and we were talking, getting to know each other during her pregnancy, and I don't even know how it came up, but somehow we got on the topic of Heavenly Mother, and she told me she was in school at the time, or had you just graduated?
I had finished the paper already, and I was like finishing up maybe my summer classes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, that sounds right. So she was right at the end of her philosophy bachelor's degree.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, oh yeah, I wrote my capstone paper on language and Heavenly Mother. And I was like,
I think you told me about your Birth Words podcast.
Yes.
And that's when I talked about that.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So I have this other podcast where I talk about language and birth. And she was like, oh, I wrote this paper about language and Heavenly Mother. And I was like, you are my soul sister. And then we chatted and chatted and chatted. And I came home from that visit that was supposed to be an hour. And Clark was, my husband is Clark. And he kind of was like, well, that was a long visit. And I was like, Sarai wrote a paper about Heavenly Mother and language. And he was like, say no more.
I understand now.
You never came home. So today awesome. We get to share with you little bits and pieces of the things that you studied when you were writing this paper, and just talk about it and kind of acquaint our listeners with it. So my question for you to begin with, Sarai, is how did you decide to write about language and Heavenly Mother for your capstone paper?
Yes. So first of all, this was back in 2019. Yeah. So it's been a few years since I wrote this. So there's some things that I have, that is really interesting to think about looking back, because, a few things have changed, in the church, and, I feel like the culture is becoming more accepting, generally speaking. But I knew for my capstone, so it's 20 pages that I had to write, and we started at the beginning of the school year. So we had 2 semesters, essentially, to do it. And so I wanted to do something that I really cared about. And I do have a philosophy degree, which is a whole other story, because I never imagined I would become a philosophy person. But if I could have, like if UVU had the option, I would have loved to major in religious studies. Mm-hmm. So that was my minor. And I really fell in love with just Mormon studies in general at UVU. And I took every Mormon studies class that was available. And I was like, wait, there's got to be more about Heavenly Mother out there. And when I found the BYU studies paper, A Mother There, and I started reading that, I was like, oh, there's so much here that I can use, and I wanted to, anyway, my big thing was, I was like, okay, I figured out about all the myths of Heavenly Mother. And once I worked through that, I was like, well, we need to be talking about her more. And so my whole paper is basically arguing about the importance of why we need to be talking about her, and kind of a call for like a public address of including her more in our language.
I love that. And I love that you chose that poem by Rachel Hens Steenblik to capture that, because that's exactly what she's saying in the poem, right? Like, we need to be inclusive of this. Like, if we believe in partnered heavenly parents, then we need to speak about that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you for choosing that. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for writing your paper about this, because we need more and more people like you writing and talking about our Heavenly Mother so that we can, grow to be like her and live with her again. So I'm going to go through kind of like the three main claims that you make in your paper, and then you can kind of summarize what you said, highlight any important details, talk about, like you mentioned, this was a couple of years ago. There might have been things that have come up since then that have changed the way you're thinking about things or that you would add. But any of those things I'd be interested to hear about too.
Okay.
So I'm going to quote your paper here. The first claim that you make is that the typical silence about Heavenly Mother, quote, holds no doctrinal or scriptural merit, but is reflective of the pre-existing patriarchal structure of the church. Can you say more about what you mean by that?
Yeah. So when I read the paper, A Mother There, it was really interesting to me because I'm like, oh, I'm not the only one that's been having these questions. And like these people who have researched this. So anyway, there were multiple people that worked on this paper. I know it was probably a big project. Yeah. But they found like so many quotes by general authorities and who openly talked about her. So there's a quote from that paper. Is that all right if I share that?
Please.
So they said, I think this is at the very end. It's kind of the conclusion of the paper, which I recommend everyone who hasn't read it. It's essential.
Yes.
But they say, we have found no public record of a general authority advising us to be silent about our Heavenly Mother. Indeed, as we have amply demonstrated, many general authorities have openly taught about her. So that is like, I would say the main myth that most people believe is sacred silence and that we're not supposed to talk about her. But after I was reading this and I was like, oh no, like I think it's really important that we talk about her. So in my paper also, I talk about, okay, well, why do we think that this is kind of like the general, like cultural mindset is that she is too sacred. So there was a seminary teacher, I believe it was recorded, I think in like the late 90s, that he is like the only person to be recorded that said that the reason we don't talk about her is essentially that Heavenly Father is protecting her from being talked about. And other than that, there's no general authorities who have ever said that. So to me, I think that at the beginning of the church, like Joseph Smith introduced the doctrine of Heavenly Mother, and we have recorded historical, documentation, which is in the book Saints. Have you read Saints?
I haven't read as I should have.
That's okay.
I've started it, but I haven't read.
But there's this awesome part where I think it's Eliza Young Gates is who he's talking to. Does that sound familiar? Susa Young Gates. Okay.
I think.
And her mom has just passed away. And Joseph Smith is comforting her and saying that, just like she's going to see her mother and once in the next life, like that there's a Heavenly Mother that she's also going to meet. And he's comforting her with those words. And I remember reading that and I was like, oh yeah, of course. Of course he taught that. And that's really important. I think that's in that book. But so like what happened along the way, right? So, Fiona Givens, I went to a talk with her and she said that Joseph Smith would have lost the church if he had openly, taught about Heavenly Mother, just because the church was just barely growing and was kind of viewed as being really out there and kind of alien compared to what was going on in America at the time. And so I think over time, people wanted a reason. Okay, well, there must be a reason why we're not talking about Heavenly Mother. It must be because, she's too sacred. Or because this is kind of part B of the sacred silence myth is that Heavenly Father needs to protect her, right? And I'm sure you've heard that one.
Yeah.
And so that to me is just that's a cultural norm of, like the men are, it's a kind of a chivalry thing of like trying to look out for the women or whatever. But, I think that because we have a church with, like mostly all male leadership making a lot of the decisions, Heavenly Mother hasn't really been a priority, I guess. And this is something that I think Margaret Toscano talks about too. She has an article in the Sunstone magazine, Is There a Place for Heavenly Mother in Mormon Theology? And she essentially is arguing that like the main reason that Heavenly Mother hasn't been talked about is because like if there were women at the top, then she would have been talked about because they would have seen it as being like, oh, there's something missing here. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
No, that's the kind I'm looking for.
Okay, good.
The long answers. I think that's really interesting too, like the point you bring up about Fiona Given saying if this had been a big talking point about the early church, like it would have alienated us even more. And there was maybe this balancing act of trying to be like, yeah, we're Christian, but we kind of have this totally different way of doing things. And we've walked that balancing act for centuries, right? Of like, how much are we a peculiar people and how much are we also Christian and we believe the things that you believe? And it's interesting to think about like, where are we now? One of the things that Patrick Mason brings up in the last chapter of Restoration is that when he's presented on church doctrine to, I think in a graduate seminar, to a mixed audience of some LDS students and some that are not and not familiar with LDS doctrine, they're really interested in the doctrine of Heavenly Mother, those non-LDS graduate students, and it's really appealing to them. And I'm really hopeful that we're in an environment and in a place where we can bring our Heavenly Mother into the conversation and talk about hers openly as we ought to, and talk about our heavenly parents as partnered. And that this can be like a nurturing atmosphere for that, rather than maybe in 1830 it would have been a more hostile atmosphere for that.
Right.
Which is really hard for me to hear or think about, right? Like, well, if it's truth, we should just be able to talk about it and go for it. But it can be a lot more complex than that.
Right. And it takes time.
Yeah. The other thing I thought about while you were talking is this interesting thing that we have as church members and church leaders and things. Like you said, nobody was talking about her. So over time, somebody said, well, like there must be a reason. So let's make up a reason. Right.
Yeah.
And it was
like a justification.
Right. Like nobody's talking about her. It must be because like we're not supposed to. She's too sacred. Whatever. I think it's interesting that we have this tendency as church members to think like, because there are so many answers in the restored gospel, that we think, oh, then we must have an answer to every question. And if there must be a reason. We must give the answer. And then even if there's silly answers like this seminary teacher, like it spreads because, well, we need an answer because we're the church of answers. So
we're the church of answers.
Here's the answer. And that's definitely one. A few years ago when I was a young women's teacher and I brought up Heavenly Mother in the lesson, one of my beehives was like, oh yeah, but we don't talk about her. She's too sacred. And I was like, well, actually, did you know general authorities haven't said that? And it's just kind of something we've gotten in the habit of not talking about her. So
I like to call it like a Band-Aid answer of like, oh, well, we don't really know, but here's like probably why. And then you put a Band-Aid on it. And like at the beginning, you're like, oh yeah, like that's fine. Like that wound is just covered for now. But then as time goes on, you're like, wait, that doesn't really heal. Like for me as a younger person, and there's other things that I feel like have been kind of Band-Aid answers too. But as time goes on, you're like, oh wait, I want to know like actually why, because that doesn't quite sit well with me. And then I like look into it more and I'm like, oh, there isn't really a reason. I had a similar experience when I was teaching primary, and Joe's my husband, by the way. We were subbing, and this was when I was working on this paper. So I was really starting to try to incorporate her more.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I mentioned Heavenly Father and it wasn't just about Heavenly Father, I would try to say either Heavenly Parents or Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother. So at the end of the lesson, I was bearing my testimony and I just said like, I know that your Heavenly Father and your Heavenly Mother love you like all so much. And a little girl, they were probably like 9 years old, but she was like, wait, Heavenly Mother? Like, well, like, can you tell me more about that?
Mm-hmm.
And just at that such young age, like she was already wanting to know. And then another girl in the class kind of shushed her and was like, oh no, remember? We're not supposed to talk about her because she's too sacred. And it was at the end of the lesson and the kids were like, you know, going out the door. And in the moment, I didn't say anything. But in retrospect, I'm like, oh, I wish I would have done like what you did and kind of like corrected that maybe.
It's a tricky place.
Yeah.
Sometimes in those classrooms where you're like, I don't want to go against whatever maybe your parents have told you. Whatever, but at the same time, like, we don't want to spread false information. Because
maybe years will go by before those girls are like thinking about it again. And that's kind of like, oh, we're not supposed to talk about her. Okay.
Yeah.
It's hard.
I love that just like childlike curiosity though of tell me more. And one of the awesome things about home church this last year, I mean, we've been going every other week, but we have, as far as, you know, primary, that hasn't happened again yet in our ward. So we've been like our kids' gospel teachers, like the only way, obviously parents always should be the primary one, but the only ones. And so we teach them about their partnered heavenly parents all the time. And it's been interesting going back to church sometimes where only one's mentioned, only Heavenly Father is mentioned, and my kids will be like, they forgot Heavenly Mother. And I'm like, but we're not going to forget her. We're going to talk about her, and we're going to remember that we have partnered parents.
That's really beautiful.
Okay. So then the next point that you make in the paper is that the silence about Heavenly Mother is harmful in reinforcing sexist ideals, consequently impeding true gender equality within the institution. And this is a quote from your paper that's for a philosophy capstone, so that sounded really formal. Basically, can you give some examples either from your personal life or scholarly examples of what it means for this silence about Heavenly Mother to be harmful in reinforcing sexist ideas and not helping us work towards true gender equality?
So I like that we were talking about the primary kids and Young Women's too. So when I was in Young Women's, our Young Women theme that we recite every Sunday, we would stand and we would say, we are daughters of our Heavenly Father who loves us and we love him. We strive to be like him, right? And I don't know if that's exact quote now, but when I was writing this paper, the Young Women's theme hadn't been changed, which now it has. And I think that's like a huge win. But I was like, well, as a young woman, to stand and say, you know, I'm a daughter of a Heavenly Father, that's absolutely true. But to say that I'm trying to be like, you know, Heavenly Father is also true. But what about Heavenly Mother? As a woman, it would make more sense for me to be striving to be like, you know, the divine feminine. And anyway, so I just thought that was really interesting with the language, because that's something that really became a part of me and that I would think about, you know, as I went about my everyday life. And if something came up, I would be like, oh, no, I'm a daughter of Heavenly Father. Like, I want to make sure I'm making the right decision. And so now I believe that they say we are daughters of heavenly parents. There's another quote that I have in my paper from Amy Hoyt. So this is from a paper, an article. Let's see how old it is. It's from a while ago. But she talks about the gendered cosmology of Mormon women. So the article is called Beyond the Victim Empowerment Paradigm, the Gendered Cosmology of Mormon Women. And she says this quote, the belief in a mother in heaven and the doctrine of exaltation enables Mormon women to imagine themselves as divine and to envision a heavenly couple who work cooperatively together. I think right now also there is a big, I don't want to say push, but there's like this awareness around partnership families, right? And making sure that We're having like an equal division of labor in the home and everything like that. And so thinking about heavenly parents, like we have to include Heavenly Mother in that in order to imagine that continuation of our home here on earth, right? And so in Preach My Gospel, which I served a mission, and I really liked this part. Let me see where it is in Preach My Gospel. Okay, so it talks about eternal marriage. And this is the in like the commandments lessons that you teach. Mm-hmm. So it says, heaven is a continuation of the ideal home. And when I was a missionary, I imagined like, okay, when I have my own family, like I want to have that type of like family culture where that's like what you want to have forever. And so in order to have heaven be a continuation of the ideal home, like we need to be able to see ourselves as becoming like an eternal version of ourselves, mm-hmm. right? Another funny thing on my mission is when people would ask us about like godhood and that we could become gods, mm-hmm. which is like totally out there mm-hmm. for most Christians, which also like Heavenly Mother doctrine is probably considered totally out there too. But I remember like other missionaries would say this little example of like, oh, if you have a child, like a puppy. Have you heard this before? No, I haven't heard that. Okay. So if you have a child, if we say that we're children of God, then wouldn't it make sense for us to grow up and be like God? And they'd say like, if you have a puppy, it like grows up to become a dog, right? And so to say that we're children of God, like, of course we would become like God too. And so a lot of times in the church, just like I shared with the Young Women's Theme, like we talk about becoming like Heavenly Father is becoming like God. But as a woman, to me, that feels not as inclusive of like who I could become, right? If I'm going to become like God, I would become more like Heavenly Mother, right? Mm-hmm. So there was another quote in here. So this was right after conference, October 2019, I believe, is when I wrote this. So there was a talk that had just happened. He was the general Sunday school president. And he said, in the premortal world, we were born as spirits to heavenly parents and lived with them as a family. And I remember hearing that, and you were probably like, yay. If you're like me, you count every time heavenly parents are mentioned mm-hmm. in general conference. Mm-hmm. Last conference.
You usually only need one hand.
Last conference is 3 that I counted. One was in priesthood session that I heard. So I counted 3 total in last conference. Anyway, so right after that, I'm like getting all excited. Mm-hmm. And then he says, we wanted very much to be like our Heavenly Father. And as a listener, mm-hmm. I was like, wait a minute, you just said that we lived with them, with both of them. Mm-hmm. And then he says that we want to be like Heavenly Father only. Mm-hmm. And so part of me is like, oh, is there something about Heavenly Mother that like I wouldn't want to be like? Or mm-hmm. like to me that seemed intentional. But yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting though, because it's so cultural. He probably didn't even realize that he was doing that. He probably thought like, oh, I said Heavenly Parents, right? And then went into the normal thing of like, we wanted to be like Heavenly Father. We want to go live with him, right? We just go back into these normal things. But once you have this awakening, then your Eliza R. Snow all over the place, like, the thought makes reason stare. What are you saying?
Of course. Truth is reason. Truth eternal. Yeah. Tells me I have a mother there.
And it doesn't make sense to totally leave her out, especially if she's mentioned and then forgotten in the next sentence.
Did you know, which I say this in here, let me like make sure I'm saying the right thing. So originally the hymn was titled Invocation or the Eternal Father and Mother mm-hmm. was the original title. Mm-hmm. Anyway, when I learned that, I was like, oh, this whole song is for both of them.
Yeah, it's like a prayer to our heavenly parents.
Yeah. Which I'm like, that's amazing. And then we sing it. For me, it's like usually Mother's Day or mm-hmm. Father's Day. Mm-hmm. Anyway, and when we sing that line, I try to sing it as loud as I can.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's like my one testimony I get to share is like singing that line about her, right? And you've probably gone to the Gospel Topics essay, which is really short. And I think it's like 2 of the paragraphs in there are about that hymn only. That's what it says. This essay, only 6 paragraphs. Okay, references the hymn as one of those paragraphs. But it does have, the Gospel Topics essay does have the A Mother there.
It references.
In the footnotes for like you to go to. And then I was like, oh, there's way more stuff here. But the other thing I was going to say about that. Oh, the whispers. So there's this artist I follow on Instagram, which I think her handle is Etta K Art. So ETTAKAY Art. But her name's Heather K. And I like reached out to her when I wrote this paper and I asked for permission to quote her. So I did. And she said that was awesome. Anyway, so she did this painting called Whispers, and it's all these women and they're lined up and they kind of have like these gowns on and they have their hands cupped to their mouths. And anyway, in her caption, she said that we whisper among ourselves the words we wished were shouted from the rooftops. And anyway, I remember reading that and thinking like, oh, I feel like that's kind of how it is sometimes, where you might like talk about Heavenly Mother in a hushed way before you see if like that other person feels comfortable talking about her. And then you're like, okay, now we can talk normally. Have you felt that before?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's like what happened in that conversation I was referring to at the beginning. Right?
Yeah, with
like,
us.
You probably were like, I wrote a paper about language and Heavenly Mother. And I was like, you what?
Well, and when I was writing it, it was funny because like that was like kind of my whole focus. Like I spent a lot of time on it. And so people would ask me, like, what's your capstone on? And like, depending on like how invested they were, sometimes I would even say, like, I wouldn't say Heavenly Mother. I would just say like, oh, I'm like writing about, LDS culture, or I'd like, like cut it out. And then depending on the person, it was also often surprising because then I would find the people that were like really interested or really excited about it. And even in my family, it was really kind of a cool thing because when I was researching, it was like, oh, now like we have a reason to talk about her and to share like, oh, I heard this quote or I heard this theory or something like that. That made me feel really good. I wish I could just like come up with reasons all the time. Even this podcast, telling people, oh, like I was invited to share on this podcast. Oh, what are you going to talk about? And then I can talk about it more.
Yeah. So that's like one of my goals in our gradual return to church is that I keep the habits that I do with like my conversations with my husband and with people that I'm interviewing for this podcast and stuff. In fact, that's the main reason that I started my Instagram account. My Mother is the Queen was to practice talking about Heavenly Mother. And I'm not like, I want to be clear that when we're like, she's not too sacred to talk about, right? That doesn't mean that we shouldn't speak reverently about her as we do our Heavenly Father, right? But it doesn't mean that we should speak about them equally as partners.
Right. Both parents. With reverence.
Right.
Yeah.
So you mentioned at the beginning that like your last thing that you do with this paper is you call on this to be publicly addressed. Like, let's not be silent about Heavenly Mother. I've shown through this paper that there's not actually a doctrinal reason for it. It's kind of this weird cultural thing that just happened. Yeah. It's actually harmful that we do this because it doesn't recognize the equal divinity of both genders of our Heavenly Parents' children. Yeah. So you said, well, this needs to be publicly addressed. My questions for you are, how have you seen that happening? Where and by whom? And then how would you like to see that happen?
So when I wrote this, it was a philosophy paper. So I had to have an argument and I had to have the points, right? And so, okay, so I'll say this and then I'll kind of say what I think now. So originally, this was right after General Conference, October 2018. So I shared that other quote it was actually Brian K. Ashton. So that was the talk that I talked about earlier. So in that same general conference, it was like a huge deal because there was a big push that we were not going to have nicknames of the church anymore. We weren't going to say Mormon in referencing the church or even LDS, that we were to say the full name, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, when referring to the religion and even your personal membership. And so President Russell M. Nelson, he like gave even a little role play of like, if someone asks you, oh, are you Mormon? You would say, yes, I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it was amazing after this happened. The style guide was released by Church Newsroom, right? And then like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir becomes the Tabernacle Choir at Temple Square, and the social media accounts change, and the website changes, and even the Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi changed, which like has been around forever.
Yeah.
Within, I think, 2 months is what I remember, that all these changes are happening. And President Nelson in his talk even said that using nicknames was offensive to the church, or to Christ himself. And so I just thought that was like so interesting. Because so he was saying that in order to clarify that the church is Christ's church, like we need to center Christ even in the name and like anytime we refer to it. So I was just thinking about that in terms of language, and like, you know, in lots of ordinances in the church, like we have to say things in an exact way, and it has to be said in an exact way. If not, like you would, like with the sacrament, you start over, or we have elder or president or, you know, different titles for people in the church. And it's like, if someone says it the wrong way, like they're corrected, right? And so I just thought it was so fascinating because, saying heavenly parents to me seems like even a smaller change than this like big change that's like encompassing all these different aspects of like, you know, it used to be LDS newsroom and now it's church newsroom, and then LDS tools is now tools, right? And even saying like earlier, I talked about Mormon studies, like there was some debate about, well, what do we call it? Do we call it LDS studies? Because that still has like an acronym, but you can't say the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints studies because that's just super long. Anyway, it's just really interesting. So like, having that huge clarification to me was like, oh, this would be really simple. This could be something that could happen in general conference of like, okay, from now on, like they could even say like, it's really, it's exclusive of our Heavenly Mother. Every time we don't talk about her when she would otherwise like be included. Right. So that was my whole point with that.
Yes. Which I still think would be awesome.
I think it would be awesome. And like after I wrote it, I was like, it's going to happen next general conference. And I was just on fire about this. But I have another, I don't think that this is something I would like, call for necessarily now. I would say that just like so many things in the church, and I was thinking about this too. I have like a whole list on my phone somewhere about, there's like so many things in the church that they didn't come from the top, right? It starts at a grassroots level, and it's not necessarily something that we have to like go out in the streets and rally people together or anything like that. But it just like happens, you know, over time of like, so one of my ancestors started the primary, Amelia Rogers. Now I'm going to feel horrible if I forget her name. It'll come to me. Anyway, but she like had an idea and she brought it to Joseph Smith, and then he was like, oh, awesome. Right. And like Emma Smith, she was the one who asked a question, and then that became the word of wisdom. And there's like these really amazing women who have come forward and been like, hey, what about this? You know, what about this thing? Or like, oh, everyone's talking about heavenly parents now. Like, it's no big deal. That's the world I imagine.
Right. Yeah.
And then we talk about it, and then it's in conference, and then it's not like a whole thing where everyone's shocked, but it's just like it happens over time.
Right. I feel like I had a very similar trajectory that I was, President Nelson was making 6 changes at every conference.
Oh, yeah.
Next conference, he's definitely going to address this.
Right.
And I told you before we started recording that Jess and I have another episode that sneak peek right here, but that will come out before the October General Conference. That's like tips on how to prepare for General Conference and how not to be let down if President Nelson doesn't get up and say, now we're going to talk about our Heavenly Parents and not use language that's exclusive of our Heavenly Mother. But I similarly have made the shift of like, actually, I want to be one of the voices who brings light to my mother. Like, I want to be, as her daughter, one that's bringing her into the conversation. And that's actually far more meaningful than someone at the top of a hierarchy.
Waiting for someone else to say, oh, okay, now you can.
Right. Like, I want to be her little missionary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Okay, this is my ancestor. It was Aurelia Spencer Rogers. I said Amelia. But if my parents were to hear this, they would want to make sure that I acknowledge her.
That's a beautiful name.
Yes.
That's awesome.
But she founded the primary.
That's awesome.
So I just think it's a really cool thing when we can be someone that is like looking for, okay, how can I make a difference? Right. And then we can be someone who is like offering those things. Mm-hmm. But I had the exact same thing where I was like, oh, I'm just going to make my own, conviction of like, I'm going to be someone that I always just make sure that if I slip up, that I correct myself and that other people hear it. And sometimes I get more nervous, which is just funny.
It is very funny, isn't it?
But even just in my own home, like making sure that I can, be more inclusive. And I think over time, people will realize, oh, this isn't a big deal. And I've heard, people that are church leaders, institute teachers, and I think Sister Eubank mentioned something about this, like Heavenly Mother isn't too sacred to talk about. And I think that there are people still maybe holding on to that and not wanting to, do the wrong thing, or their cultural understanding is just really deeply rooted. Is that the right thing to say? Anyway, so it might take time and we're not used to it. Yeah.
I feel like it's a good change, though.
Yes.
I'm excited.
I think it's a beautiful change.
To see it happening. I'm excited to be working on it with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking this time to talk with me and to tell everybody a little bit about your paper. Thank you for referencing that BYU Studies paper so much about a mother there. That, again, like I will put it in the show notes for this episode so that people can go read it, because one of the things that it really addresses, like you're saying, is that myth about the sacred silence. And I think if you overcome that, then that's like the first hurdle.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for choosing to spend some time with us today. We love this community and would be thrilled to hear from you. Please leave us a review. If you would like to support the podcast, you can make a monthly donation of 99 cents on up to $9.99 at anchor.fm/inherimage/support. We hope you'll subscribe and join us again next Sunday for another inspiring episode.